Two orphan sisters, starving and freezing, break into a theater seeking shelter. They beg to sing and play in exchange for food, and are humiliated before a cruel audience. But a powerful man stops everything when he recognizes in them the face of a lost love. If this story interests you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you're watching from. Let's continue. The city of Chicago awoke that August morning to the biting cold that only a Chicago winter knows. The wind blew between the downtown buildings, carrying with it the smell of coffee from the bakeries and the hurry of the workers who filled the sidewalks. But amidst all this commotion, two small girls walked slowly, huddled together, their bare feet touching the icy asphalt and their frightened eyes facing a world that seemed too big for them. Helen and Beatrice were only 5 years old when everything changed. Until that cruel winter, they had lived with their mother, Marianne, in a modest boarding house in the Pilsen neighborhood. Marianne was a seamstress, working in garment factories and taking on odd jobs at night to ensure her daughters had at least one plate of food a day. There were no luxuries, no leftovers, but there was love. An immense love that overflowed in the tight hugs before sleep, in the lullabies Marianne invented to soothe the twins, and in the gentle way she combed the girls' identical hair every morning. Marianne had a sweet, melodious voice. Even tired after hours hunched over the sewing machine, she found the energy to sing while preparing dinner or tidying up the small room where they lived. Helen and Beatrice grew up lulled by those melodies, and from a very early age they showed a natural interest in music. They sang along with their mother, drummed on the old kitchen pots and invented rhythms with any object they could find. Life was hard, but it was theirs. Until one July night, when the cold intensified brutally, everything fell apart. Marianne had lost her job at the garment factory 2 weeks earlier. A broken machine, a mistake that wasn't hers, but the blame fell on her shoulders anyway. Without a steady salary, she became dependent on odd jobs, which were scarce in the winter. The rent was late, and the landlord of the boarding house, a man with no patience for sad stories, unceremoniously evicted them on a grey afternoon. With 2 old suitcases and her daughters in hand, Marianne went in search of shelter. She knocked on the doors of acquaintances, sought out churches, and tried public shelters that were all full. Night fell quickly, and the cold became unbearable. The girls shivered, huddled in thin coats that were not enough for that winter. Marianne pulled them into an alley between 2 abandoned buildings downtown, a place that at least blocked some of the biting wind. There, sitting on the cold concrete floor, Marianne hugged her daughters with all the strength she had. She took off her own coat and covered them both, wrapping her body around them to transfer what little warmth she had left. The girls cried softly, scared and cold, but their mother sang. She sang softly, whispering in their ears, promising that everything would be all right, that this was just one bad night and that tomorrow the sun would shine brighter. But the sun did not shine for Marianne. When morning came, Helen and Beatrice woke up still in their mother's arms, but something was different. Marianne wasn't moving. She didn't respond to their calls. Her body was stiff, cold, but her arms still held her daughters firmly, as if even in her last breath she had fought to protect them from the merciless cold. The girls didn't understand. They shook their mother, begged her to wake up, cried in desperation. Passers-by began to gather. Someone called an ambulance, and soon Helen and Beatrice were separated from Marianne's body by strange hands, trying to explain something they couldn't comprehend. Their mother was gone. She was gone forever, leaving only a memory and a small golden brooch in the shape of a musical note that she always wore pinned to her coat. A social worker took the brooch from Marianne's trembling hands and gave it to the girls. It was all that was left. That piece of golden metal was the only tangible thing that still connected Helen and Beatrice to the woman who had been everything to them. The weeks that followed were a confusing blur of unknown faces, endless paperwork, and constant changes. With no known family, no documents proving any living relative, the twins were sent to the first of a series of shelters that would mark their childhood. The St. Francis Home for Children was located on the south side of Chicago, in an old damp building that housed nearly 50 children who were abandoned or vulnerable. The rooms were overcrowded, with rusty bunk beds squeezed together. The smell of mold permeated the peeling walls, and the food was scarce and tasteless. But the worst part wasn't the precarious structure. The worst part was the emptiness, the absence of affection, of attention, of someone who would look at them and see more than just two more problem children. Helen and Beatrice were inseparable. They slept in the same bed shared, the same plate, and cried together when the longing for their mother became too much. At night, huddled under the thin blanket, they would whisper the songs Marianne used to sing, trying to keep the memory of the sweet voice that had been their safe harbor alive. The first few months at the home were a forced adaptation. The other children already had their groups, their alliances, and they didn't welcome the arrival of two quiet, frightened twins. There were fights over food, disputes over space, and the staff at the home could barely manage the basic routine, let alone offer individual emotional support. It was in this hostile environment that Helen and Beatrice discovered an unexpected refuge: music. 3 blocks from the home was a municipal music school, an old but well-maintained building where children and teenagers from the area took lessons in singing, instruments, and music theory. The school's windows were always open, and the sound of rehearsals escaped through the grates, spreading through the neighborhood. Every afternoon, when the mandatory activities at the home were over, Helen and Beatrice would sneak out to the sidewalk in front of the music school. They would sit there, leaning against the wall, and listen for hours. The sound of the piano transported them to another place, a place where there was no cold, no hunger, no loneliness. The voices of the children's choirs echoed like a call, and the twins would close their eyes, absorbing every note, every melody, every harmony. Without realizing it, they began to reproduce what they heard. They sang softly, imitating the voices coming from the school. They tapped out rhythms on their thighs, trying to keep time with the music. And when they returned to the home, they continued to sing, inventing harmonies between themselves, one completing the other's voice naturally and instinctively. The other children at the home found this strange. Some mocked them, others simply ignored them. But Helen and Beatrice didn't care. Music had become their way of talking to their mother, of feeling that she was still present, of believing that not all was lost. One afternoon, as they were sitting in front of the music school, the door opened and a teacher came out carrying sheet music. She was a middle-aged woman with grey hair tied in a bun, her reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck. She noticed the 2 girls there, as always, watching with attentive eyes. She approached and asked their names. Helen and Beatrice shyly answered softly. The teacher, whose name was Claudia, smiled and asked if they liked music. The girls nodded, awkwardly. Claudia then asked them to sing something, anything they knew. The twins looked at each other, hesitant. But then, together, they began to sing one of the songs their mother used to sing. Their voices intertwined perfectly, creating a pure and moving harmony. Claudia stood still in silence, listening. When they finished, she had tears in her eyes. She asked where they had learned to sing like that. Helen, the more talkative of the 2, explained that their mother always sang and that they tried to remember. Claudia wanted to know where they lived, and the girls pointed to the home. For a few months, Claudia began to set aside a few minutes at the end of the afternoons to teach the twins right there on the sidewalk. She showed them simple breathing techniques, taught them scales, and corrected their pitch. She couldn't do more than that. The school had strict rules and the girls were not enrolled, but those few minutes were enough to light a flame within them. Helen and Beatrice flourished. Their voices, once intuitive, gained technique. They learned to control their timbre, to sustain long notes, to harmonize with precision. And when Claudia mentioned that the school had an old piano that no one used much, the girls begged to at least see it. Claudia gave in. On a Saturday afternoon, when the school was empty, she allowed them to enter. She took them to a small room in the back, where a dark wood upright piano rested against the wall. It was out of tune. Some keys were stuck, but to Helen and Beatrice it was the most beautiful instrument they had ever seen. Claudia showed them the basic notes, the position of their hands, the correct posture, and then she let them explore. Beatrice, always quieter and more observant, sat on the bench and pressed a few keys. The sound that came out was imperfect, but magical. Helen stood beside her, singing as her sister played. It was the beginning of something special. Whenever they could, They would sneak to the music school, and Claudia, in a rare act of kindness, would let them. Practice. The girls absorbed everything like sponges. Beatrice developed an incredible skill at the piano, playing by ear melodies she heard only once. Helen, in turn, had a powerful and emotional voice, capable of bringing tears to anyone who listened. But the world is not made only of kindness, and reality soon came knocking at the door again. When Helen and Beatrice turned 7, the St. Francis home received a visit from a family interested in adoption. They were a middle-aged couple, childless, who wanted a girl to raise. When they saw the twins, they were enchanted by their physical resemblance, their identical brown hair and green eyes, the childlike delicacy that still endured despite everything. But they only wanted one. The social worker at the home tried to argue that it would be better to keep the sisters together, that separating them would be traumatic. The couple, however, was adamant. They could only afford to raise one child, and that was their final decision. The employee, pressured by adoption targets and the overcrowding of the home, gave in. On a day that Helen and Beatrice would never forget, they were called to the director's office. There, in front of adults who spoke in bureaucratic terms and signed papers, they were told that one of them would be adopted, and the other would stay at the home. The girls clung to each other, crying, begging not to be separated. Helen screamed that she wouldn't go without her sister. Beatrice sobbed desperately, but firm hands pulled them apart. Helen, being slightly taller and having been chosen by the couple, was taken away by force, while Beatrice was held back by a staff member. Their screams echoed through the halls of the home. Helen struggled, trying to go back, but she was put in a car that drove away. Beatrice was left there at the gate, watching her sister disappear around the corner, feeling a part of herself die with her. The adoptive family's house was in Lincoln Park, a middle-class neighborhood on the city's north side. It was a comfortable residence with individual bedrooms, a spacious living room, and even a small garden. The couple, Martha and Anthony, tried to be kind, but Helen couldn't reciprocate. She spent her days in silence, refusing food, crying secretly in the room that was now hers alone. At night, when the house fell silent, Helen would take out the golden brooch she always carried with her and whisper imaginary conversations with Beatrice. She promised she would come back, that she would never forget her, that she would find a way for them to be together again. Meanwhile, at the St. Francis home, Beatrice was wasting away. She stopped eating properly, stopped going to the music school, and spoke to no one. She would sit for hours alone in the yard, hugging her knees, singing softly the songs she used to sing with Helen. The staff tried to help, but there was no possible comfort for that pain. 3 weeks passed since the separation, 3 weeks that felt like an eternity. Helen, despite trying to adapt to her new life, couldn't sleep. The comfortable room, the plentiful food, the new toys, none of it mattered. Only one thing mattered: Beatrice. On a rainy September night, Helen made a decision. She waited for Martha and Anthony to fall asleep, grabbed a small backpack where she kept some clothes and her mother's brooch, and climbed out of the bedroom window that led to the garden. She didn't know exactly how she would get back to the south side, but she knew she had to try. She walked through the silent city, asking for directions from scrap collectors working in the early morning, following half-confused instructions, getting lost and starting over. The rain soaked her clothes, the cold numbed her fingers, but she didn't stop. Only one thing pulsed in her heart: to find her sister again. When the sun rose, Helen finally recognized the area. There was the home, with its grey, peeling facade. But something made her stop before going in. An intuition, a certainty that Beatrice wouldn't be there. She turned left and walked to the quay music school. It was closed, it was Sunday. But as she rounded the building, she saw a small figure sitting on the steps of the side entrance, brown hair wet from the rain, clothes soaked through, arms wrapped around her knees. Beatrice. Helen ran. Beatrice lifted her head at the sound of footsteps, and upon recognizing her sister, froze for a second, as if witnessing a miracle. Then she got up and ran too. The two met halfway, hugging each other with such force they seemed to want to merge into one person. They cried, they laughed, they cried again. They didn't need words. They were together, and that was everything. But the joy was brief. When they tried to enter the music school, they discovered something terrible had happened. The side door was broken in, shattered glass scattered on the floor. They entered carefully and ran to the room where the piano was kept. What they saw left them devastated. The room was destroyed. Empty beer cans on the floor, graffiti on the walls, broken furniture. And the piano, the instrument that had been their refuge, was shattered. The internal strings ripped out, the keys broken, the wood cracked. Someone had used the space for late-night parties and had shown no mercy. Helen and Beatrice stood there, looking at the wreckage. They didn't cry. They had no more tears. They just felt, deeply and definitively, that their childhood had been stolen from them. Not just by fate, but by the cruelty of a world that never cared. They left the music school hand in hand. They knew they couldn't go back to the home together. Helen would be returned to her adoptive family. They knew they had nowhere to go, but they also knew they would not be separated. Again. Ever. And so they returned to the streets. 2 7-year-old girls alone in the big city with only a golden brooch and each other. They slept in the doorways of closed shops, begged for food at bakeries, and sang in public squares to earn a few coins. People passed by them without a second glance, just 2 more invisible children among so many others. But they had something most didn't. They had music, and they had a silent promise they made on the night they were reunited. They would never give up on their dreams. They would never let the world extinguish the last flame of hope that still burned within them. The months dragged on. Helen and Beatrice learned to survive on the streets of Chicago. They met other boys and girls in similar situations, shared food when they had it, and protected each other from the dangers that lurked around every corner. They sang every day, sometimes in front of restaurants, other times in subway stations. Some people would stop to listen, moved by the purity of their childish voices. They would toss coins into an old cap the girls placed on the ground. With the money, they bought bread, sometimes a piece of cake, and rarely managed to save enough for a more complete meal. But they never complained. They were together, and that was enough. Until one day, as they were singing in front of a diner on Michigan Avenue, a man approached them. He was tall, dressed in a dark suit, and had an air of authority. He listened for a few minutes, then knelt down to their level and asked their names. Helen and Beatrice answered cautiously. They were used to being wary of adults. The man introduced himself as Gerald Stevens, an employee of the Department of Social Services. He said he knew many children in their situation and that he could help them. He spoke with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, a false kindness that the girls couldn't identify at that moment. Gerald offered them food, said he knew a place where they could sleep safely, and even promised to get them new documents. Helen and Beatrice, tired and hungry, agreed to go with him. It was the beginning of a new nightmare. But they would only discover that later, when it was too late to turn back. Gerald Stevens was not what he seemed. On the outside, he projected the image of a dedicated public servant, always with a briefcase under his arm and a rehearsed speech about public policies and child protection. In the corridors of the Department of Social Services, he was known as someone efficient, who could resolve complicated cases and close reports with impressive numbers. But behind the facade was a corrupt man who had been embezzling funds meant for vulnerable children for years, forging documents and using his position to exploit those he was supposed to protect. When Gerald took Helen and Beatrice to the safe place he had promised, the girls quickly realized something was wrong. It was an abandoned warehouse on the north side, where other street children were crammed together. There were no beds, only old mattresses scattered on the floor. There was no food to spare, only controlled rations that Gerald brought sporadically, and most importantly, there were rules. The children had to work, selling trinkets at traffic lights, committing petty thefts at street markets, collecting recyclable materials, and turning everything over to Gerald. In return, they received a roof over their heads and just enough food to keep from starving. Anyone who complained or tried to leave was threatened. Gerald knew people on the police force, he would say. He knew people in the shelters. He could make the children disappear from the map with no one to look for them. Helen and Beatrice found themselves trapped. They couldn't go back to the official shelters without being separated again. They had no documents, no one to vouch for them, and Gerald knew exactly how to keep them under control, with fear and dependency. But the twins did not lose their essence. Even in that hostile environment, they continued to sing. At night, when Gerald left and the children retreated to their corners, Helen and Beatrice would sit together and sing softly. It was their way of resisting, of remembering that they were still human, that they still had something no one could steal. Some of the other children would gather to listen, boys and girls of various ages, each with their own story of abandonment and suffering. The twins' music brought a moment of peace to their daily hell. A boy named Raphael, who was only 9 but looked much older due to his tired eyes, befriended them. He protected the girls when some of the older teenagers tried to intimidate them, and shared his food on days when Gerald was late with supplies. Raphael knew things about Gerald that the girls had not yet discovered. He told them one cold night that the official forged reports about the children who passed through there. He would tell the authorities that he had placed them all in adoptive homes or foster care. In reality, he kept them all working for him, siphoning off the money that should have been invested in social assistance. No one looked for these children because officially they had already been rescued. Helen was outraged. Beatrice, always quieter, just squeezed her sister's hand. They knew they had to get out of there, but they had no way. They were too small, too vulnerable. The months dragged on in that suffocating routine. Helen and Beatrice were forced to go out on the streets, sell candy at busy intersections, and beg for money at strategic spots in the city. Gerald controlled everything, visiting the places where the children worked, collecting the money at the end of the day. If someone didn't bring back the expected amount, they went without dinner. It was during these months that the twins saw the cruelest side of Chicago up close, the indifference of people rushing by without looking at dirty, barefoot children, the insults from impatient drivers when they approached the cars, the violence from other homeless people fighting over territory, the constant humiliation of being treated like trash, as if they had no value, as if they weren't human. But they also saw small acts of kindness that kept them from completely losing faith in humanity. An old woman who stopped every day to give them a piece of fruit, a baker who at the end of his shift gave them the leftover bread, a young student who sat next to them on the sidewalk and talked to them as if they were real people, asking their names, their dreams, their stories. Helen, always more outgoing, talked about music, about how she and Beatrice sang, about the piano they once played, about the dream of one day performing on a real stage for people who wanted to listen with an open heart. The student, moved, gave the girls a small crumpled poster she had in her backpack. It was an advertisement for a concert that would take place in 2 weeks at the Grand Chicago Theater. The State Symphony Orchestra would be performing, with classical works and a guest children's choir. Helen kept that poster as if it were a treasure. At night, she showed it to Beatrice. They stared at the image of the imposing theater, with its marble staircases and crystal chandeliers, and they dreamed. What if they could get in? What if they could show their music to those elegant people? Maybe someone would notice them. Maybe someone would actually help them. Beatrice thought it was impossible. They were just 2 street girls, dirty, ragged, without documents, without anyone. Who would let them into a place like that? But Helen didn't give up easily. Ever since their mother had passed, since they had been separated and found each other again, since they had survived so much, Helen had developed a fierce stubbornness, a refusal to accept that life would always be this way. And then, winter came again. 2 whole years had passed since Marianne's death. Helen and Beatrice were now 7 years old, but they looked older from the hardship life had etched on their childish faces. And that winter was particularly brutal. Temperatures in Chicago plummeted. The nights became unbearable. The warehouse where they slept had leaks, drafts of wind that cut through the cracks, and few blankets to share among so many children. Gerald appeared less and less, leaving them to fend for themselves for days on end. Hunger also tightened its grip. There wasn't enough food. The children fought over scraps, hiding pieces of bread so they wouldn't have to share. Helen and Beatrice, always together, shared everything they managed to get, but it was getting harder and harder. They went 3 days without eating anything but water, and some old crackers that Raphael managed to steal from a supermarket dumpster. It was on one of those nights of intense hunger and cold that Helen looked at the crumpled poster of the Grand Chicago Theater, which she kept hidden under her mattress. The concert date was in 2 days, just 2 nights away. She woke Beatrice, who was sleeping restlessly beside her, and whispered her plan. They would go to the theater. They would try to get in. They would ask for a chance to sing, just one chance. In return, they would beg for food, a hot plate, a piece of bread, anything. They couldn't go on like this. They had to try. Beatrice hesitated. She was scared of being shooed away, humiliated, hurt. But Helen held her hand and said something their mother used to say: "We have to believe there is kindness in the world. Even when everything seems lost, we have to believe." Beatrice gave in. On the day of the concert, the two left the warehouse early, before Gerald showed up to assign the day's tasks. They walked through the city, following street signs asking for directions, until they reached downtown. And there it was, the Grand Chicago Theater, imposing, majestic, with its neoclassical columns, stained glass windows, and a wide staircase leading to the main entrance. Elegant people began to arrive, women in long dresses, men in suits and ties, all chatting excitedly as they climbed the steps. Helen and Beatrice looked at each other. Suddenly, they felt the weight of their appearance. Torn and dirty clothes, tangled hair, broken nails, bare and wounded feet. They looked like two creatures from another world, completely out of place in that luxurious setting. But hunger was stronger than shame. Helen took a deep breath, held Beatrice's hand, and the two of them climbed the staircase. With each step, they felt the judgmental stares of the people around them. Some wrinkled their noses, others moved away as if the girls were contagious. When they reached the main door, 2 uniformed security guards immediately blocked their path. One of them, a large man with a harsh expression, asked sharply what they wanted there. Helen, her voice trembling but determined, explained that they wanted to speak to someone in charge, that they could sing in exchange for food. The second guard laughed, a cruel, mocking laugh. He told the girls to go away, that this was no place for beggars. When Helen insisted, he pushed them lightly, causing them to lose their balance and nearly fall down the stairs. Beatrice began to cry softly. Helen felt anger rise, but she swallowed it. They couldn't give up. They went down the stairs and began to walk around the building, looking for another entrance. There was one on the side where cargo trucks were parked. Staff dressed in black were carrying musical instruments and equipment into the theater. The back door was ajar, with no one watching at that moment. Helen looked at Beatrice. It was now or never. The two ran and slipped through the opening. The inside of the theater was even more impressive than the outside. Long hallways with red carpets, walls decorated with classical paintings, immense chandeliers hanging from the high ceilings. The sound of instruments being tuned echoed everywhere. Voices mingled, technicians shouted instructions. There was a frantic energy of preparation. The girls walked slowly, trying not to attract attention. They followed the sound of a piano and reached the wings of the stage. They peeked through a heavy velvet curtain and saw the immense stage lit by powerful spotlights. The orchestra was already in position, musicians in their places, adjusting sheet music. In the center, seated at the piano, was a middle-aged woman in a navy blue evening gown, her hair in an elaborate updo. It was Monica Evans, a renowned pianist known for her impeccable technique and difficult temperament. Next to the piano, with a baton in hand and a rigid posture, was Maestro Richard Forrester. Tall, thin, with grey hair combed back, he was famous for his almost cruel demands on the musicians and his coldness in dealing with anything that deviated from the standard of excellence he set. The audience was already beginning to fill up. Rich, influential people, dressed in the most expensive and sophisticated attire. They talked about investments, international travel, social events. For them, that night was just another among many, a cultural event where they could be seen, photographed, admired. Helen squeezed Beatrice's hand. There was no turning back. They took a deep breath and walked to the center of the stage. The silence that followed was deafening. All the musicians stopped what they were doing. The maestro lifted, his head incredulous. The pianist turned on her bench with an expression of shock and disgust, and the audience, which had been chatting animatedly, gradually fell silent, all eyes turning to the two dirty, barefoot girls who dared to be on that sacred stage. Helen felt her legs tremble, but she stood firm. Beatrice beside her was pale, but she didn't run. The two advanced until they were right in the center, under the brightest spotlight. Maestro Forrester stepped down from his podium and walked towards them with firm steps. His expression was one of contained fury. He stopped a few inches from the girls and asked, in a low voice laden with threat, who they thought they were to interrupt a rehearsal of the country's greatest orchestra. Helen swallowed hard. Her voice came out shaky, but clear. She said they were just two girls who could sing, that they hadn't eaten in days and were only asking for a chance, a single chance to show what they could do in exchange for a plate of food. Silence returned. Some musicians exchanged uncomfortable glances. The pianist Monica made a sound of contempt, and then from the audience the laughter began. First quiet, then louder, until it became open guffaws, people laughing at the absurd situation, at the audacity of these miserable children, at the ridiculous interruption. Maestro Forrester smiled, but it was not a kind smile. It was a cruel smile, from someone who sees an opportunity for amusement at the expense of someone vulnerable. He looked at the audience, made a theatrical gesture with his hands, and announced in a loud voice that, why not? He would give these girls the chance they asked for. Monica protested, saying it was absurd, but Forrester silenced her with a look. He knew exactly what he was doing. This would be a lesson, a demonstration of what happens when common people without talent, without education, without pedigree, try to enter the world of high culture. He gestured to the girls, pointing to the piano. Beatrice looked at Helen, frightened. Helen nodded. They had no other choice. They walked to the instrument. Beatrice, with trembling hands, sat on the bench. Helen stood beside her, preparing to sing. The audience was still laughing, malicious comments echoing through the theater. Someone shouted for them to just take their coins and leave. Another suggested someone call the police. But before Beatrice could play the first note, before Helen could open her mouth to sing, something happened. A loud sound of clanking metal, and then a bucket full of ice-cold water fell on the two girls. The water drenched them completely, soaking their hair, their already dirty clothes, making them shiver even more from the cold. The theater exploded in laughter. Loud, mocking, cruel laughter. The people in the audience were enjoying themselves as if they were watching a circus act. The musicians looked at the floor ashamed, but none of them had the courage to intervene. Monica laughed openly, and Maestro Forrester, satisfied with his prank, crossed his arms and watched the girls with an air of superiority. Helen and Beatrice were paralyzed for a moment. The cold water, combined with the shock of the humiliation, left them speechless. Beatrice began to cry, silent sobs that shook her thin shoulders. Helen bit her lip hard, trying to hold back the tears that stung her eyes. They would not cry in front of them. They would not give them that satisfaction. But then a voice cut through the collective laughter, a deep, authoritative voice that made the entire theater fall silent instantly. It came from the back of the audience, from the highest rows where the private boxes were located. A man rose from his seat and began to walk down the side stairs towards the stage. He was tall, dressed in an impeccable charcoal grey suit, had perfectly combed grey hair, and a presence that exuded power and respect. It was Edward Sterling, the owner of the Grand Chicago Theatre, a respected businessman, known for his austerity and his investment in the arts. He rarely appeared at rehearsals, preferring to watch only the final performances, but that night, for some reason, he had decided to come early. Edward walked down the central aisle, his footsteps echoing in the absolute silence that had settled. He climbed onto the stage with an expression no one could decipher. He approached the drenched girls, and for the first time, he looked at them up close. And then something happened, something no one expected, not even Edward himself. When his eyes met the twins' faces, when he saw the delicate features, the brown hair, the frightened green eyes, something inside him broke. A deep, inexplicable shock that made him stagger for a second. Those girls had her face, Marianne's face. Edward Sterling was not a man to show emotion in public. He had built his reputation on pillars of firmness, rationality, and control, but at that moment, faced with those two drenched and shivering girls in the center of the stage, something inside him crumbled. His hands began to tremble, his breathing became ragged, and for the first time in over a decade, he felt tears threaten to escape his eyes. Marianne. How was it possible? How could two street children have the exact same features, the same brown hair with golden highlights, the same green eyes that had bewitched him so many years ago? Maestro Forrester, sensing the tension in the air, tried to intervene. He approached Edward with a fake smile and said he was sorry for the interruption, that he had already arranged for the girls to be removed from the theatre. But Edward cut him off with a sharp gesture of his hand. His voice, when it finally came, was laden with an emotion that surprised everyone. He demanded to know who had authorized this humiliation, who had the audacity to throw ice water on two hungry, frightened children. The silence that followed was heavy. No one dared to answer. Edward repeated the question, this time more forcefully, his voice echoing off the theatre walls. It was one of the stagehands who finally admitted it. He said, stammering, that it had been the maestro's idea, a joke to teach the girls a lesson about respect and hierarchy. Edward turned to Forrester with an expression that made the maestro take a step back. But Edward had no time to deal with that now. His attention turned completely to the girls. He took off his own coat, an Italian wool overcoat, and draped it over their shoulders. Helen and Beatrice looked at him, not understanding what was happening. Who was this man? Why was he looking at them like that? Why did he seem so shaken? Edward knelt before them, bringing himself to their level. He asked their names, and when Helen answered, her trembling voice saying they were Helen and Beatrice, he closed his eyes for a long moment. Then, carefully, he asked about their mother. What was her name? Where was she? Beatrice, who rarely spoke to strangers, was the one who answered this time. She said their mother's name was Marianne, that she had passed away on a winter night a long time ago, that she loved them very much and sang beautiful songs. Edward felt the world spin. Marianne, the confirmation he both feared and desired. He asked the girls to wait there on the stage and that no one was to touch them. His voice had a tone of command that no one dared to defy. Then he turned to the packed theatre and, for the first time in all those years, decided to tell his story. 20 years ago, Edward Sterling was Edward, the young heir of a traditional Chicago family. He had everything money could buy, an education at the best schools, trips around the world, a guaranteed future in the family business. But he had no passion, no purpose, no real life, until he met Marianne. It was a Sunday afternoon in a small park on the south side. Edward had gone there by chance, escaping yet another boring family lunch, and there she was, sitting on a bench, singing softly as she sewed something. She had a sweet, pure voice that made him stop and listen. When she looked up and smiled shyly, he knew he would never be the same. They began to meet in secret. Marianne was from a humble background, working in garment factories to support herself. She had no family, having grown up in orphanages. But she had a joy for life that was contagious to Edward, an inner strength he had never seen in anyone. She made him laugh. She made him dream. She made him want to be a better person. The relationship lasted for 2 intense years. Edward hid it all from his family, knowing they would never accept a woman with no last name, no money, no pedigree. But he didn't care. He planned to run away with her, marry in secret, and start a new life away from family expectations. But the family found out. And when they did, they used every resource at their disposal to separate the couple. Threats, blackmail, manipulation. Edward's father, a powerful and unscrupulous businessman, forged documents that made it seem like Marianne was a gold digger interested only in the family's money. He spread rumors, bought false witnesses, and destroyed her reputation everywhere she worked. Edward tried to resist, but the pressure was too much. His father threatened to disinherit not only him, but also to use his influence to ensure Marianne would never get a job anywhere again, that she would be persecuted, humiliated, destroyed. And then, they did something even worse. They told Edward that Marianne had accepted a large sum of money to disappear from his life, They showed him falsified documents, forged receipts, even a letter she had supposedly written saying it was all about financial gain. Edward, young and naive, believed them. He felt betrayed, used, destroyed. He stopped looking for Marianne. When she tried to contact him, he refused. The letters she sent were intercepted by his family. The phone calls were blocked. And so, without ever knowing the truth, Edward let Marianne disappear from his life. What he didn't know, what he had never imagined, was that Marianne was pregnant. Pregnant with twins. His twins. Marianne tried every way she could to tell Edward about the pregnancy, but all doors were closed. His family had made sure she couldn't get close, and she, proud and hurt by the supposed rejection, decided to move on alone. She worked until the last day of her pregnancy, gave birth in a public hospital, and raised the girls with all the love she had, even without resources, even without support. Edward never knew. He went on with his life, took over the family business when his father passed away, and became a successful businessman. But he never married. He never loved again. Marianne had been the one, and after the supposed betrayal, something inside him died. He buried himself in work, built a business empire, but lived an empty, mechanical, colorless life. And now, there on that stage, before two girls who were the living image of the woman he had loved, the whole truth was revealed in a painful and devastating way. Marianne had not betrayed him. Marianne had carried his daughters, raised his daughters, loved his daughters, and in the end had perished, trying to protect them from the cruel cold of a Chicago winter. Edward turned his attention back to the girls who were watching him with a mixture of fear and hope. He asked, his voice choked with emotion, if their mother had anything special. Some object, some memento she always carried. Helen, not understanding why it mattered, pulled the small golden brooch in the shape of a musical note from inside her dirty shirt. It was all they had of their mother, the only material object that remained. When Edward saw that brooch, his legs gave way, and he had to lean on the piano to keep from falling. He had been the one to give that brooch to Marianne. On her birthday, when they were still together, when they still believed that love was enough. Marianne had never taken it off, always wearing it pinned to her coat, saying it was her good luck charm, the physical proof that someone truly loved her. There were no more doubts. These girls were his daughters, daughters he never knew existed, who grew up in poverty, who survived unimaginable horrors, while he lived in his ivory tower, blind to the suffering he could have prevented if only he had fought harder, if he hadn't believed his family's lies. Edward knelt again before Helen and Beatrice. His hands trembled as he held the girls' small, cold hands. His voice was just a whisper when he finally said the words that changed everything. He told them he was their father, that he had loved their mother more than anything in the world, that he had been deceived, manipulated, pushed away, that he never knew they existed, but now he knew, and he would never, ever abandon them again. Helen and Beatrice looked at each other, then back at Edward. They didn't fully understand what it meant. Father. This man was their father. How was that possible? Where was he when their mother died? Where was he when they were starving? Where was he when they were separated, humiliated, exploited? The questions hung in the air. Edward saw the confusion, the distrust in the girls' eyes, and knew he had a long road ahead to regain the trust that life had destroyed in them. But it didn't matter how long it took. He would do everything to make up for the lost years. He stood up and turned to the audience, which remained in shocked silence. His voice, when he spoke, was filled with a contained anger that made everyone shrink back. He said that this theater, this stage, this space that should be dedicated to art and culture, had become the scene of one of the greatest cruelties he had ever witnessed. That people who called themselves educated, cultured, superior, had laughed at the humiliation of two starving children, that they had applauded malice as if it were entertainment. He pointed to Maestro Forrester and the pianist Monica. He said they were fired right there, that instant, that he would not tolerate having people capable of such inhumanity in his theater. Forrester tried to protest, citing his reputation, his years of service, but Edward cut him off with an icy glare. He said that a reputation built on the humiliation of the vulnerable was worthless. That talent without humanity was just empty technique without a soul. And that if the entire orchestra shared those values, then they should all leave because he would rebuild this place from scratch, but with people who knew the true meaning of art. Some musicians lowered their eyes, ashamed. Others began to get up and leave, unable to face Edward's judgment. The audience, which minutes before had been laughing uncontrollably, was now in sepulchral silence, each person dealing with the weight of their own complicity in that collective cruelty. Edward turned his attention back to Helen and Beatrice. He said they would never again know hunger, cold, abandonment, or shame, that they would have a home, an education, all the opportunities they should have had from the beginning. But most importantly, he said they would have the love of a father who, although he had arrived too late, was here to stay. The girls still didn't know if they should believe him. They had learned the hard way that beautiful words didn't always become reality, but there was something in Edward's voice, in the way he looked at them, that sparked a small, fragile hope. Edward took them by the hands and led them off the stage. Before leaving, he turned one last time to the audience and the musicians who still remained. He said that this night marked the end of an era for this theatre, that from now on it would be a place of welcome, not exclusion, a place where anyone's talent would be valued, regardless of their background, their clothes, their bank account. And then he left with the girls, leaving behind a theatre in shock, an orchestra in shambles, and an audience that would have that night forever etched in their consciences. In the days that followed, the news of what had happened at the Grand Chicago Theatre spread throughout the city. Newspapers published stories about the businessman who discovered he had daughters living on the streets and who had fired an entire orchestra for cruelty against children. Some applauded Edward's actions, others criticized him, saying he had been too radical. But Edward didn't care about opinions. He had a mission now, and nothing would deter him. The first few weeks were an adjustment for everyone. Edward took Helen and Beatrice to his home, a spacious mansion in the Gold Coast neighborhood. The girls, accustomed to sleeping on dirty mattresses in abandoned warehouses, now had a huge room with soft beds, warm blankets, and toys they had never dreamed of having. But the transition was not easy. Helen and Beatrice would wake up startled in the middle of the night, thinking it was all a dream. They ate quickly, afraid the food would run out. They hid pieces of bread under their pillows, as they had on the streets. It took them a while to trust the household staff, and they would run away if someone approached too quickly. Edward understood that healing would take time. He hired psychologists specializing in childhood trauma, who began working with the girls to help them process everything they had been through. Slowly, Helen and Beatrice began to open up, to tell their stories, to mourn their losses, to express the anger and confusion they felt. Edward was present every step of the way. He sat with them for meals, read them stories before bed, and patiently answered every question they asked. And slowly, very slowly, a bond began to form. It wasn't automatic, it wasn't magical, but it was real. One night, when Edward went to say goodnight to the girls, he found Helen crying softly. He sat on the edge of the bed and asked what was wrong. Helen, between sobs, asked if he was really going to stay, if he wouldn't disappear again, if it was true that they were his daughters, or if it was all just another lie from adults. Edward felt his heart break. He held Helen's small hand and made a promise. He said he would never be separated from them again, that he had made terrible mistakes in the past, that he should have fought harder for their mother, that he would forever carry the guilt of not having been there. But now he knew the truth, and he would dedicate every day of his life to making up for lost time. Helen looked into his eyes, and for the first time since her mother had passed, felt something she hadn't felt in years, the feeling that someone truly cared, that they were no longer alone in the world. And as Edward hugged his daughters, promising himself he would never fail them again, he had no idea that someone was watching from afar, someone who would not be happy with this turn of events. Gerald Stevens, the corrupt official who exploited street children, had found out where Helen and Beatrice were, and he was not willing to lose two of his best sources of income without a fight. Gerald Stevens had always known how to stay invisible. It had been his strategy for years: operate in the shadows, manipulate paperwork, forge reports, and embezzle funds meant for vulnerable children without anyone suspecting. He had allies at various levels of the public bureaucracy, people who turned a blind eye in exchange for a share of the profits. It was a well-oiled system that worked because no one cared enough about street children to investigate thoroughly. But now, for the first time in years, Gerald felt something he wasn't used to feeling: fear. Helen and Beatrice had disappeared from the warehouse weeks ago, and when he finally found out where they were, he could hardly believe it. Living in the mansion of Edward Sterling, one of Chicago's most influential businessmen, being treated like daughters, having access to lawyers, doctors, education, this was a problem, a huge problem. Because if the girls started talking about the time they spent under his control, if Edward decided to investigate, the entire corruption network Gerald had built could collapse. He needed to act. Fast. He started discreetly. He forged a new report, this time claiming that Helen and Beatrice had been kidnapped from the official shelter where they were supposedly registered, that Edward Sterling was keeping them illegally without proper documentation. He took the report to a corrupt judge he knew, someone who had helped cover up other irregularities in the past. But Gerald underestimated Edward. The businessman was not one to leave loose ends. As soon as he took responsibility for the girls, he hired the best lawyers to regularize their entire situation. He investigated their history, discovered the flaws in the records, the inconsistencies in the official reports. And the more he investigated, the more he began to realize that there was something very wrong with the social services system that should have protected his daughters. That's when Edward found Raphael. The boy who had been friends with Helen and Beatrice in Gerald's warehouse had managed to escape months earlier and was living in a real municipal shelter, one of the few that functioned properly. When the social workers at that shelter heard Raphael's story about the clandestine warehouse, about the official who exploited children, they contacted the authorities. And the authorities contacted Edward because they knew he was caring for two girls who had come from that very environment. The investigation began quietly. Edward, with his resources and connections, ensured it was conducted by trustworthy people, away from the eyes of anyone who might warn Gerald. Independent auditors began to examine the records of the Department of Social Services. Lawyers analyzed documents. Private investigators followed Gerald discreetly. What they discovered was worse than they had imagined. For over 10 years, Gerald had embezzled funds, kept children in conditions analogous to forced labor, and forged documents claiming they had all been adopted or reintegrated with their families. There were dozens, perhaps hundreds of children who had passed through his hands and never received the assistance they were due. And he didn't work alone. He had a network of accomplices that included other public officials, inspectors who looked the other way, and even some heads of official shelters who received bribes to not ask questions. Meanwhile, in the Gold Coast mansion, Helen and Beatrice were slowly beginning to rebuild their lives. Edward had hired private tutors to help them catch up on the years of schooling they had missed. The girls were intelligent, learned quickly, but still carried the emotional scars of everything they had lived through. Music continued to be their refuge. Edward, noticing this, transformed one of the rooms in the house into a small studio. He bought a new grand piano, a beautiful instrument that Beatrice could hardly believe was for her to play. He hired voice coaches for Helen, who began to develop her voice technically without losing the natural emotion that had always characterized it. One afternoon, while the girls were rehearsing in the studio, Edward watched them through the slightly open door. Guilt still weighed on his heart. He knew he could never undo the past, never erase the years of suffering his daughters had endured, but he was determined to build a different future. That's when he had an idea. If he couldn't change Helen and Beatrice's past, perhaps he could change the future of other children like them, children with hidden talents who would never have the opportunity to develop them because of poverty, abandonment, or lack of support. In the following weeks, Edward began working on an ambitious project. He would use his influence and resources to create a social program specifically aimed at vulnerable children who showed artistic aptitude. The program would offer free classes in music, dance, theater, and visual arts. It would provide instruments, materials, food, and transportation, and most importantly, it would provide hope. The Grand Chicago Theater would be the heart of the project. Edward began a complete renovation of the space. He hired new musicians for the orchestra, but this time with different criteria. It wasn't enough to have technical talent. One had to have humanity, sensitivity, and a commitment to inclusion. He brought in a new maestro, a black woman from a humble background who had overcome countless barriers to become one of the most respected conductors in the country. Her name was Clarice Mason, and she embraced the project with genuine enthusiasm. But while Edward was building this future, Gerald was plotting behind the scenes. His attempt to use the legal system to get the girls back had failed, but he didn't give up easily. He started spreading rumors around the city using his contacts in the tabloid press. He claimed that Edward Sterling had kidnapped 2 children to satisfy some personal whim, that he was keeping them locked up, that it was all a sham. The articles began to appear on dubious news sites and social media. People who didn't know the full story began to question Edward's intentions. Some well-meaning but ill-informed activists even organized protests in front of the mansion, demanding that the children be returned to the social services system. Helen and Beatrice, who were finally beginning to feel safe, were frightened by all the commotion. They heard the shouting outside, saw the cameras, the signs. They began to fear they would be taken away again, separated again. That's when Edward decided it was time to act decisively. He gathered all the documentation his investigators had collected on Gerald and his corruption network. He called a press conference where he would present not only the truth about his daughters, but also publicly expose the scheme that had destroyed so many children's lives. The press conference was scheduled to take place at the Grand Chicago Theater itself, in a symbolic gesture. Edward wanted the place that had been the scene of his daughter's humiliation to also become the scene of justice. On the scheduled day, the theater was packed. Journalists from all major outlets, authorities, activists, representatives from the district attorney's office. And Edward, for the first time, presented Helen and Beatrice to the public, but respectfully protecting their identities with discreet clothing and keeping them at the back of the stage. He told the whole story: his relationship with Marianne, his family's manipulation, her disappearance, the discovery of his daughters, the state in which he found them. He presented documents, photos, proof of everything he said. And then he moved on to the second part, the denunciation of Gerald Stevens. He projected onto the theater screen documents proving the embezzlement, the children who had disappeared from the system, the forged reports. He presented recorded testimonies from Raphael and other children who had been exploited. He showed photos of the warehouse where the children were kept, the subhuman conditions, the complete lack of dignity. The impact was immediate. TV cameras broadcast everything live. Social media exploded with the revelation. The district attorney's office, which was present, announced right then and there that it would open a formal investigation. The FBI was called in to investigate the corruption network that extended through various public agencies. Gerald Stevens, watching the press conference on television in his modest apartment, knew he was finished. He tried to flee, but was arrested that same night, along with several of his accomplices. The police operation dismantled the entire network, arrested corrupt inspectors, and removed incompetent managers. It was one of the largest operations against corruption in the social services field in Chicago. But for Edward, Helen, and Beatrice, this wasn't about revenge. It was about justice. And most importantly, it was about ensuring that no other child went through what they had. In the following weeks, the social project at the Grand Chicago Theater began to take shape. The first call for applications was opened, offering spots for 200 vulnerable children. Thousands of applications poured in. Poor families, children from shelters, homeless teenagers, all wanting a chance. Helen and Beatrice participated in the selection process, not as judges, but as witnesses. They wanted to be there to see with their own eyes other children receiving the opportunity they almost didn't have. And when they saw the anxious faces, the hopeful eyes, they felt that the pain they had gone through had gained a new meaning. The first class began 3 months after the press conference. The theater was renovated to include proper classrooms, rehearsal studios, a library, and even a cafeteria where the children would receive nutritious meals. Top-tier teachers were hired, many of them professional musicians who volunteered to participate in the project. Helen and Beatrice also took classes there, along with the other children. They received no special treatment, they didn't want any. They just wanted to belong, to be part of something bigger than themselves, and slowly they made true friends, met other children with stories similar to theirs, and realized they were not alone. Beatrice continued to develop her talent at the piano. Her teacher, a Portuguese pianist who had been captivated by the project, said the girl had a rare gift, an ability to convey emotion through the keys that could not be taught, only polished. Beatrice, always quiet, let the music speak for her, and when she played, the entire auditorium fell silent to listen. Helen, for her part, discovered she had not only a beautiful voice but also a natural stage presence. When she sang, she moved people. It didn't matter the music, whether it was classical or popular, sad or joyful. There was a truth in her voice that reached the hearts of those who listened. Her voice, Coach said it was because Helen sang with her soul, not just with technique. A year after the press conference, the Grand Chicago Theater organized its first major performance with the children from the Social Project. It would be a benefit concert where the children would showcase everything they had learned. The proceeds would go to expanding the program to other cities in the state. Edward invited the same elite who had laughed at his daughters that terrible night a year earlier. He wanted them to see what these children, when given opportunity and respect, were capable of. Many of those who had been present for the humiliation attended, some out of curiosity, others out of genuine remorse. The night of the concert arrived. The theater was packed, every seat occupied. On stage, 200 children prepared, some holding instruments they had learned to play, others ready to sing, dance, act, all nervous but also excited. Maestro Clarice Mason took the podium. The orchestra, now composed of musicians who understood the true meaning of art, took their positions. And then it began. Quality music, executed with technical perfection, but above all with heart. The children's voices rose in harmony, pure and emotional. The instruments conversed, creating melodies that touched the soul. In the middle of the concert, the most anticipated moment arrived. Helen and Beatrice would take the stage for a special performance. Beatrice sat at the piano, her delicate hands on the keys. Helen stood beside her holding a microphone. And then they began to sing and play the same song their mother used to sing to them when they were little, before the world hurt them. There was no laughter this time, no mockery, no cruelty. There was only reverent silence, and then as the last note faded, into the air applause, a standing ovation, prolonged, emotional. Many people were crying openly, touched by the beauty of the performance, but also by the story they knew, by the redemption that moment represented. Edward, sitting in the front row, was crying too. He cried for the girl's mother who would never see this moment. He cried for the lost years, the wasted opportunities. But he also cried with joy because his daughters had survived, had endured, and were now flourishing. After the concert, there was a reception. People approached Edward to congratulate him on the project, to offer donations, to ask how they could help. The elite who had once been cruel now wanted to be part of the solution, some genuinely, others perhaps just to ease their conscience. Edward accepted all help because he knew the project was bigger than individual egos. It was about the children. That night, as they were heading home, Edward asked Helen and Beatrice how they had felt. The girls looked at each other, then smiled. They said they felt like their mother was there, in the theater, watching, proud. That they had sung for her in her memory to honor the love she had given when she had nothing else to give. Edward hugged his daughters and promised that he would continue to fight every day to build a world where no child would have to go through what they had, where talent was not a privilege for those born with a silver spoon, but a right for all who had the gift and the will to learn. The following years were ones of growth. The program expanded to other cities, then to other states. Thousands of children passed through the classes, and many of them became professionals in the arts, proving that talent exists in every corner, just waiting for an opportunity. Helen and Beatrice continued to study music, but they never lost their humility. They knew where they came from. They knew how many children were still on the streets, invisible, forgotten. And when they turned 15, they began to actively participate in the project, not just as students, but as mentors to the younger children. They told their stories, not to seek pity, but to inspire. To show that it was possible to survive the storm, possible to rebuild after destruction, possible to dream even when all seemed lost. And most importantly, to remember that every child, no matter their background, their clothes, their social condition, is a complete human being with the right to dignity, opportunity, and love. Edward never married, never had other children. Helen and Beatrice were enough. They were everything. He dedicated the rest of his life to them and to the project he had created. And when, years later, he was asked in an interview if he regretted giving up part of his business life to dedicate himself to his daughters and social work, he replied that he had nothing to regret. He said, he had wasted many years living an empty life, chasing things that didn't matter. But his daughters, even arriving late, even through pain, had given him the most precious thing there is, a true purpose, and that if he could go back in time, he would have fought harder for Marianne, would have been braver, would have challenged his family, would have been there for his daughters from the beginning. But since he couldn't change the past, he would ensure that the present and the future were different. For Helen, for Beatrice, and for every child who crossed his path. Helen became an opera singer, nationally recognized for her emotional voice and her dedication to social causes. Beatrice became a concert pianist, known not only for her impeccable technique, but for the sensitivity with which she played. The two remained inseparable, performing together whenever possible, their voices and melodies intertwining in the same magical way they always had. And always, before each performance, they would hold together the small golden brooch in the shape of a musical note that had belonged to their mother. It was their ritual, their way of remembering where they came from, the love that sustained them on the darkest days, and the woman who gave everything until her last breath to protect them. The story of Helen and Beatrice did not have a happy ending in the traditional sense, because the pain of the past never completely disappeared. The scars remained, the difficult memories still visited them in occasional nightmares. But it had an ending of hope, proof that it is possible to rebuild, that love can conquer cruelty, that everyone deserves a second chance. And most importantly, it had an ending that made a difference, because their story inspired real change. Laws were created to strengthen the oversight of social assistance programs. More resources were allocated to culture and education for vulnerable children. The Grand Chicago Theatre became a national benchmark for artistic inclusion. How many other children with hidden talents were finally seen? How many voices that would have been silenced by abandonment and poverty now sang, played, created? How many families were rebuilt not by blood, but by love and the choice not to give up? These questions echo to this day, and the answer lies in every child who is given an opportunity, in every talent that flourishes despite adversity, in every voice that refuses to be silenced. Because in the end, the story of Helen and Beatrice is not just theirs. It is the story of all the children who are still waiting to be seen, heard, loved. It is a reminder that behind every dirty face, every torn piece of clothing, every plea on a street corner, there is a complete human being, with dreams, talents, and an infinite potential, just waiting for the chance to be revealed. And as long as there are people willing to look beyond appearances, to see the humanity where others see only statistics, to believe that everyone deserves dignity, there will be hope. A hope that sings, that plays, that resists, and that, against all odds, wins. End of story. Dear listeners, we hope the story of Helen and Beatrice has touched your heart. If you were moved by this journey of pain, overcoming, and hope, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments what marked you the most in this narrative. Every day we bring intense stories like this one, which reveal the deepest side of the human soul, that remind us of the importance of empathy and second chances. Each story is a window to better understand ourselves and the world around us. We look forward to seeing you in the next episode with another story that will stir your emotions and make you reflect on what truly matters in life. Until next time.